Have you ever been judged before anyone even knew your name? Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong, not because of what you did, but because of how you looked? Imagine this. You're a young black woman, sitting quietly on a plane, headphones in, just waiting for takeoff. And suddenly, a flight attendant calls the cops on you. No warning, no explanation, just fear cold and unfair. In that moment, what would you do? Argue, cry, walk away? Or would you stay silent, knowing that your silence might speak louder than any words ever could? But here's where life twists the story. Because when the police arrive, so does her father. And he's not just any man. He's the CEO of the very airline she's flying with. Now ask yourself what happens when power meets prejudice, when calm meets chaos, when a father sees the world hurt his daughter in the very place he built. Would you forgive or would you fight? Would you stay silent or use your voice to change everything? This is not just a story about race or class or authority. It's a story about what happens when empathy walks into the room and changes it forever. If you've ever been misunderstood, if you've ever wished someone would just listen, this story is for you. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truth. Stay with us, like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will stay in your heart long after the story ends. Afternoons at Chicago O'Hare Airport have a rhythm all their own. Between the gleaming check-in counters and the blaring loudspeakers, the female voice of the automated teller machine is soft, dry, and repetitive, as if reciting a tuneless song. Outside the glass doors, planes line up, noses pointed toward the runway. The late afternoon sun shines down, reflecting off the gray stone floor, sparkling like 1,000 tiny mirrors. Nyla Carter walked slowly through the bustling crowd. She had a black backpack on her right shoulder, a small silver suitcase in her other hand, and an old canvas tote bag on her left shoulder. She was slim and tall. Her black eyes were large and calm, but there was something tired in them. On the electronic screen, the words Gate B-27, Aurora Air Flight 662 to Atlanta flashed in blue. She looked at her watch. 40 minutes to boarding. She stopped at the Starbucks in the lobby. She got an iced mocha with a little whipped cream. As her mother had always told her, drink something sweet before you fly. It will make you feel better. Her mother was in Atlanta, undergoing treatment for stage 2 cancer. She was thinner. Her hair was falling out. But she still joked, "Don't worry. I just need a new towel." Nyla chuckled when she remembered that. But the smile, like now, was fleeting in a breath. She chose a chair near the window, sat down, opened her laptop, but did nothing. Just stared at the blank screen and let her mind drift. She remembered her classes at Howard University, the school she loved, the days of running from class to class with a folder in hand, her hair tied up in a hurry. She loved that busy feeling, loved the people around her, diverse, strong, and believing that they would make a difference in this society. But sometimes she still had a lingering scar in her heart, a feeling that, no matter how hard she tried, there were still eyes that never really considered her normal. She had heard her father talk about it when she was little. You have to be twice as good to be treated like everyone else. She never forgot those words. The overhead speaker blared again. Aurora Air Flight 662 to Atlanta is now boarding Group A. His voice was even and soft, but it made her heart beat faster. She stood up, put her laptop in her tote bag, picked up her suitcase, and walked towards Gate B-27. The boarding area was crowded, but orderly. A long line of passengers was waiting, some laughing and talking, some looking at their phones, some grumpy from exhaustion. She stood in the middle of the line, still holding the e-ticket that lit up on her phone screen. Up ahead, Deborah Collins, the flight attendant, stood next to a male employee. She wore a navy blue uniform, her hair pulled back, her face carefully made up, her smile firm. From a distance, Nyla saw Deborah smile at a few older passengers, her voice friendly, but somehow forced. Deborah had had a long day. She had worked 9 hours, had 2 difficult passengers, and hadn't had lunch yet. Her mind was spinning between schedule and discipline. As Nyla approached, she straightened her coat and handed her phone to Deborah to scan the ticket. Deborah looked at the screen and nodded. Everything was normal. But when Deborah's eyes fell on the tote bag, her expression froze. A moment. No one said anything. Then Deborah looked up and looked Nyla up and down. The slight smile was gone, replaced by a very professional scrutiny, cold and precise, like the gaze of someone used to giving orders. "Miss, is that your carry-on or your personal item?" Deborah asked, her voice flat. Nyla paused. "Yes, this is my personal bag. I only have a small suitcase in this bag." Deborah glanced at the suitcase. "That suitcase is cabin size, but this bag is a bit big." "It still fits the sizer," Nyla said quietly. Calmly, "It might, but I have the final say. Please, put it here." She pointed to the steel sizer frame beside her. Nyla bent down and placed the bag in. It fit snugly into the frame. Not an inch of space. The people in the back row started to look, some curiously, some shrugging, some frowning. Deborah stood still. A second, 2 seconds. Then she said, "Even if it fits, it looks bulky. I can't allow that in the cabin." Nyla looked up, smiling slightly. "Ma'am, there's only my mother's laptop and medicine in here. I've flown many times before. No one has ever told me not to bring it." Her voice was soft, not confrontational, just explanatory. But it was that calmness that made Deborah uncomfortable. She felt like she was being challenged, and she hated that most of all. "Sweetheart," Deborah said slowly, "this is my flight. I decide what gets on the plane and what doesn't." The words fell through the air. Not loudly, but it made a few people in line step back slightly. Nyla took a deep breath. She started to say something, but stopped. 2 emotions were fighting inside her: anger that wanted to say something back, and her father's words. Not every battle is worth fighting. She chose to remain silent, but inside, something began to crack, like a small crack in glass. Little did she know that in just a few minutes, from that tote bag, from that look, a wave would start. A small wave, but strong enough to shake an entire airline. Deborah Collins had been standing at gate B-27 for more than 3 hours. Her high heels were starting to hurt the soles of her feet, but she kept a smile on her face. The smile she had mastered over 20 years of service, bright enough to make passengers feel welcome, but not so intimate that they forgot she was in charge of the cabin. She knew how to modulate her voice, when to be gentle, when to be firm, and when to be cool. Today, everything seemed to be off track. In the morning, the first flight was delayed for more than 2 hours due to a luggage problem. A middle-aged passenger yelled at her, threw his coffee cup on the floor, and shouted, "You guys have nothing to do but fake smiles." She wiped the floor, maintaining that smile until the man disappeared behind the plane door. But from then on, that smile lost its naturalness. She hated being taken for granted, hated people who thought that flight attendants were just people who served drinks and smiled for tips. To her, this was a prestigious profession, one of discipline and control. She once told her younger colleagues, "If you don't have discipline, the sky will swallow you." Now, standing at the gate, she adjusted her uniform. The line of passengers was still scanning their tickets. Everything was normal until she saw the young black girl standing in the middle of the line, holding a phone displaying a glowing QR code. The girl had a gentle face, deep eyes, and was strangely calm. But it was that calmness that made Deborah feel uncomfortable, as if there was something in her eyes that refused to yield. When she saw the tote bag, something flashed through her mind, a mix of tiredness and residual frustration from the morning. The canvas bag felt soft and bulging. No obvious violation, but it felt too big. She wasn't sure, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she wanted to prove she was following the rules. When she asked the girl to put her bag in the sizer, people started to stare. The looks made Deborah feel like she had to prove her authority. She didn't want any passenger to think she was vulnerable. She'd seen hundreds of similar cases, people who tried to say it's just a small bag, then stuffed their laptops and jackets into the overhead bin, taking up space for others. This time, she wouldn't let that happen. But as the bag fit snugly into the frame, Deborah suddenly felt embarrassed. She could have let the girl pass, just nodded and said, "You're good." But her embarrassment turned to a feeling of unease, as if she had been defeated. And she didn't like losing, not in front of others, not in front of a girl so young. She smiled, a forced smile. "Even if it fits, it looks bulky," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We can't risk blocking underseat space. You'll have to check one of them." The girl Nyla looked up. Her voice was small, clear, and polite. "Ma'am, in here is my mother's laptop and medicine. I only have a small suitcase. I don't plan on putting this bag overhead." Deborah looked her straight in the eyes. "I understand, but I can't make an exception. If I give it to you, the next person will ask for it." "But," Nyla started to say, then stopped. She swallowed her words. Deborah saw the hesitation, and it made her think she had taught a lesson. She turned to Alan, the gate supervisor, and nodded to continue boarding. Alan frowned slightly. He had worked with Deborah many times and knew she tended to get tense at the end of a shift. He stepped closer and whispered, "Deb, that girl didn't do anything wrong." Deborah replied, not looking at him, "I know, but if I give in today, there will be 3 more tomorrow." Alan sighed. "Don't make a big deal out of a small thing." Deborah shrugged and smiled wryly. "I was just following the rules." As the line thinned, Deborah glanced back. Nyla was still standing in the same spot, clutching the strap of her bag. She didn't argue, didn't speak, just stared into space. There was something about that look that made Deborah feel scrutinized, as if she'd done something wrong and she didn't understand why. In that moment, old memories surfaced. She recalled her youth, her first time as a flight attendant, when a passenger yelled at her for giving her the wrong drink. That day, she cried in the break room, and the flight leader just said, "Don't cry. Smile and stand up straight. Our only power is our composure." From that day on, Deborah learned to hide all her emotions behind a smile. But gradually, she forgot that composure is not coldness. Alan turned back to his clipboard, preparing to close the gate. Deborah still saw that Nyla hadn't left. The girl stood near the window, seemingly on the phone with someone. Deborah felt like she was being watched, even though Nyla didn't turn around. The feeling made her heart beat faster. A young employee walked over and asked, "Do you want me to talk to her?" Deborah shook her head. No need. I'll handle it. She adjusted her tie and stepped forward. Miss, are you ready? I can't let you board the plane with 2 bags. Nayla looked at her, her voice low but firm. I don't have 2 bags. Miss, this is my personal bag. Deborah sighed heavily. You can put it under the seat, but I have to be sure. Can you open it for me to see? There was a pause. The passengers behind her murmured softly. Nyla paused, her gaze wavering. She hesitated for a few seconds, then slowly unzipped her bag. Inside, there was only her laptop, a notebook, a box of pills, and a photo of her mother wearing a scarf. Deborah looked down, then up. For a moment, she felt like a stranger in her own body. She could end it all here, but the fatigue inside her wouldn't stop. It sought reasons to continue, to prove it was still in control. Okay, she said slowly, but I'll let you know. I don't want any trouble if the cabin is full. Neela nodded, trying to smile, her voice soft. Thank you. She pulled her suitcase up the gangway. Deborah stood there, a mixed feeling rising in her heart, half relief, half anger. She returned to her desk and quickly wrote a few lines in the internal minutes. Passenger showed attitude, refused to comply at first. Alan saw it and whispered, Deb, you don't have to write that down. Just leave it there, Deborah replied wearily. If anything happens, I have to have a record. Little did she know, just a few hours later, those words would come back like a double-edged sword. The boarding gate closed, and Deborah stood still for a moment, looking out the window. Outside, the runway was long and the sunset was red. She took a deep breath and said softly to herself, just another bad day. But at the other end of the tube, in the cabin, a young woman sat down in her seat, staring into the distance. Nyla put her hand on her tote bag, feeling her heart still pounding. She wasn't angry, just disappointed. She wondered, would my mother understand if she saw this? She leaned her head back in her seat and closed her eyes. The speaker blared softly, Cabin crew, prepare for departure. She heard Deborah's voice echo through the cabin professional. Clear. Perfect. Part of Nyla thought, maybe she's tired too, but another, deeper part of her remained silent. Outside the window, the plane began to taxi. Neither woman knew that this flight would change their lives in ways neither expected. Aurora Air Flight 662 began to taxi onto the runway. The cabin was lit by soft yellow lights that stretched across rows of dark blue seats. The atmosphere seemed peaceful, but underneath were taut wires, waiting for the slightest movement to snap. Deborah Collins walked down the aisle, checking seat belts and bags in the overhead bin. Her steps were steady, her voice soft with passengers, but her eyes were tense. She was trying to maintain control after a tiring boarding session. When she reached the 14th row, she stopped. Nayla Carter was sitting by the window. Her tote bag was tucked neatly under the seat in front of her, as per protocol. Nyla bowed her head, holding her earphones, her eyes half closed. But Deborah paused longer than necessary. She looked at the bag, then at the young woman's face. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no challenge in the look, only weariness and serenity. But in Deborah's mind, it was a reminder that she was stuck. She didn't know why her heart was beating so fast. Maybe it was Nyla's silence that made her feel wrong. Or maybe it was the fear that she no longer had control of the situation. Deborah turned away, adjusted her scarf, tried to act like nothing had happened. But a male passenger sitting in the row behind Nyla noticed. He looked at Deborah, frowned, and said quietly, "That girl didn't do anything wrong." Deborah heard but didn't respond. She just clenched her clipboard tighter in her hand and kept walking. 10 minutes later, when the plane reached a stable altitude, Deborah started serving drinks. She moved with the cart, asking each row water, juice, or coffee. Everything was normal until she reached Nyla's row. She stopped the cart, her voice colder than before. "What would you like?" Nyla took off her headphones and replied softly, "Water, thank you." She held out a cup. Deborah poured the water, but when she handed it to Nyla, her hand shook slightly. A few drops of water fell on the girl's hand. "Sorry," Nyla said first, a polite reflex, but Deborah felt offended. "It's okay," she replied, her voice rising. "You should just be more careful." A few nearby passengers looked up. The attention made Deborah uneasy. She wanted to get out of the area as quickly as possible. But just then, Nyla's tote bag tipped and slid a little. A corner of the medicine box fell out. Deborah saw it. Something inside her snapped again. "Miss, I told you your bag might be in the way. I need you to put it in the overhead." Her voice was no longer calm. Several people looked up. Nyla, surprised, replied softly, "It's in the right place, under the seat." Deborah crossed her arms. "I saw it slide out. Do you want me to remind you about the safety regulations?" Nyla took a deep breath. She didn't want to argue, but she felt pushed to the limit. "Could you be a little quieter? I didn't do anything wrong." The words weren't loud, but they rang loud in the quiet cabin. A few passengers looked at each other. A few pulled out their phones. Deborah felt her face heat up. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. "I'm being polite," she replied, her voice rising. "If you don't comply with the crew's instructions, I'll have to report you." Nyla looked straight at her, her voice calm. "I comply. You're just trying to prove a point." The words took Deborah by surprise. She had never been spoken to like that on a flight before. Years of self-control and obedience to the rules seemed to shatter in her mind. "You're being dramatic," she said quietly, then turned to the colleague behind her. "I need to report this passenger." The cabin was dead silent. An elderly couple looked at each other. The husband whispered, "What happened?" "She was just sitting there." A young man gently tapped his phone back. Nyla felt her throat dry, but she didn't burst into tears. "She just said, 'I'm sorry if you think so. I didn't mean it.'" Deborah didn't reply. She pulled out her walkie-talkie and whispered, "Passenger 14C is uncooperative. Make a note for police assistance upon landing." The words fell like a heavy stone. Nyla froze. She looked around, saw a few people looking at her with pity. A girl in the next row whispered, "You did nothing wrong." But Nyla didn't answer. She felt fear spread through her. Police. Just the word. Enough to make her tremble. She thought of her mother, of the stories in the newspapers, of people being called uncooperative for saying one wrong thing. Deborah stepped back quickly, trying to calm herself. In the crew break room, she stood before the mirror and took a deep breath. "I was just following the rules," she told herself. But when she looked into her own eyes, she felt tired. Part of her whispered, maybe that girl really didn't deserve this treatment. But her pride swallowed her voice. Back in the cabin, Deborah passed Nyla without looking. She saw that the bag had been pushed further under the seat, neatly tucked away beyond reproach. But instead of relief, she felt empty. More than an hour later, the plane was preparing to land. The captain's voice rang out, warm and steady. "We are about to land in Atlanta. Thank you for your cooperation." Passengers adjusted their seats, fastened their seatbelts. The atmosphere seemed normal again. But for Nyla, every minute that passed was a storm in her mind. She thought about being held at the gate, being questioned, being looked at with suspicion. Little did she know that on the other end, Deborah had sent an electronic report to Aurora Air Headquarters Passenger 14C, refused instruction, potential safety issue. One click, and things were out of hand. As the plane touched down on the runway, Neela looked out. Atlanta stretched out in the afternoon sun. She missed her mother, the gentle smile she had always had when she met her at the airport. This time, maybe things would be different. The intercom sounded again. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival. Deborah did a final check of the cabin. As she passed Neela, she said quietly, almost automatically, "You should cooperate with security when you get off the plane." Neela didn't respond. She just stared straight out the window, her eyes bright from the sunlight. But deep inside was a vague fear. When the plane came to a stop, Deborah opened the door. 2 uniformed security officers entered. One said quietly, "Passenger 14C will have to stay and work with us." The cabin erupted in a soft gasp. A few exclaimed, "Really?" An elderly woman exclaimed, "Oh my God." She just sat there. Deborah stepped back, keeping her face impassive. Nyla stood slowly. She was shaking, but she said softly, "Yes, I understand." She picked up her tote bag and walked out of the row. They didn't look at each other as they passed Deborah. Outside the plane, the airport lights were bright. 2 police officers gently gestured for her to follow. The loudspeaker came again, emotionless as usual. "Welcome to Atlanta." But to Nyla, it was the harshest greeting she had ever heard. The plane doors opened, and the hot, humid air of Atlanta poured in like a wave. Passengers began to leave, suitcase wheels clicking on the metal of the gangway. But in row 14, Nyla Carter remained standing, her hands clutching the strap of her tote bag. 2 security guards were waiting at the door, their faces calm but distant. One of them spoke quietly to Deborah Collins, then turned to Nyla. "Miss, we just want to talk for a moment. Please follow us." Their voices were not loud, not at all rude, but in Nyla's heart. The 2 words security rang out like a hammer. She swallowed, nodded, and tried to stay calm. She knew that at this moment, any small action could be misinterpreted. She carefully picked up her bag and followed them down the tube bridge. Passengers passed by. Some looked at her with concern. Some took out their phones to secretly film. An old woman put her hand on Nyla's shoulder and said softly, "Son, stay calm." She just nodded. In a small room near the gate, cold white fluorescent lights illuminated the walls. On the table were several reports and a tape recorder. A policewoman named Miller sat down opposite, her voice soft but precise. "We have a report from the crew about passengers not following instructions. Can you tell me what happened?" Nyla took a deep breath. "I am not sure. The flight attendant said my bag was too big. I showed her. It fit within the sizer. I thought everything was fine, but then she said I was being uncooperative." Miller nodded, taking notes. "Did you yell, protest, or refuse the request?" Nyla shook her head, her voice low. "No, I just said that my bag was in compliance. I have a sick mother, and I have medicine in my bag. I was afraid of being separated from it." Miller looked up, his eyes softening. "Do you have anyone with you today?" "No. I'm flying alone." "Do your parents know about this?" Nyla hesitated for a few seconds, then replied softly, "I'll call my father." She flipped open the phone, her hand shaking slightly. Her fingers slid to the familiar number. When the other end answered, a deep male voice rang out, clear and calm. "Are you here, Nyla?" Her voice was tight. "Dad, something happened." There was a pause. Then Richard Carter asked, his voice deep, "What happened?" "Someone called the police on me. The flight attendant said I was disobeying orders." There was silence on the other end. Only a very soft sigh could be heard. "I didn't do anything wrong." "Did I?" "No, Dad. I just argued a little. But I didn't yell. I promise." Richard spoke slowly, each word clearly. "Stay there. Don't say anything more. Dad is on his way." Nyla put the phone down on the table, her hands still shaking. Officer Miller looked at her, tilting his head slightly. "Is your father around here?" "He works for Aurora Air." Miller nodded, not asking further. Meanwhile, a few miles away, in the glass building of Aurora Air headquarters, Richard Carter stood in the middle of a 13th floor conference room. In front of him was a quarterly plan board. Behind him were executives discussing brand strategy. But when he heard the call from his daughter, all the sound in the room seemed to disappear. He only said one sentence. "The meeting is adjourned. I need to leave." No one dared to ask. They just watched him gather his files, put on his suit jacket, and leave the room in silence. Richard walked quickly down the hallway, eyes fixed on the road ahead. He pictured his little girl, trying to stay calm amid the crowd. Since his wife's illness, Nyla had been the only bright spot in his life. She was strong, gentle, and believed in justice. But he knew the world wasn't always fair, especially to people of their color. The airline trolley took him to the airport in 15 minutes. He didn't say a word the whole way. When the trolley stopped in front of gate B-27, a few staff members stood up, recognizing him, the chief operations officer of Aurora Air. But he simply said, "I need to see security right now." Nyla sat huddled in the small room, her eyes downcast. Deborah Collins stood in the opposite corner, clipboard in hand, trying to maintain her composure. When Richard opened the door and entered, everyone in the room fell silent. He was tall and erect, his face cold and calm. But there was something in his eyes that froze the air. He looked at his daughter first. "Are you okay?" Nyla nodded, her lips pressed together. "Yes, Dad." He turned to Deborah. "Are you the chief flight attendant for Flight 66-2? "Yes, sir," Deborah said, stuttering slightly. Richard looked at her directly, not angrily, but his voice had a weight that made everyone stop breathing. "You reported that this passenger was not following orders. I want to know what orders." Deborah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked at Nyla, then down at the slip. Her bag was oversized. She protested. Richard continued, his voice even. "How many inches over?" "No, I didn't measure, but it looked." He interrupted, his voice soft but cold. "You said looked like. You mean you weren't sure?" Deborah blushed, silent. Richard bent down to his daughter's tote bag on the table. He measured it with his eyes. It fit under the chair. He looked up. "Miss Collins, I've worked at Aurora Air for 25 years. I'm the one who signed off on the baggage regulations you're citing. This bag doesn't violate them. Let me ask you again, are you enforcing the regulations or asserting your authority?" The room was silent. Deborah bit her lip. She didn't know what to say. Her mind flashed back to that morning. The scolding, the contemptuous looks, the accumulated fatigue. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. She just wanted to maintain some measure of control. But now, in front of this man, All reason paled in comparison. Richard straightened up and turned to Officer Miller. "I believe there is no reason to detain this passenger any longer." Miller nodded immediately. "No violations. We will close the case." Deborah wanted to say something, but Richard looked at her, his voice low and soft. "Miss Collins, sometimes the smallest power requires the greatest kindness. A person can make a mistake, but it is how you handle it that they remember." The statement was not loud, but it caused the room to fall silent. Nyla stood up and walked over to her father. "I'm okay." "Dad," she said softly, her voice cracking. He put his hand on her shoulder and nodded. "I know, but some things can't be left unsaid." Deborah watched them leave the room, her heart heavy. She didn't hate Nyla, nor did she hate Mr. Carter. But for the first time in years, she felt small. And in that moment, she realized it had all started with a tote bag and a look she didn't understand. The dansson. On the way to the parking lot, Nyla held her father's hand tightly. "Dad, if you weren't in the company, I would have been arrested." Richard was silent for a long time, then said softly, "Maybe, but that's why I won't let this go. Not just for me, but for everyone else." They stepped out into the Atlanta afternoon sunlight, where hundreds of planes were still taking off, each with a different story. For Nyla, it was an unforgettable chapter. For Richard, it was the beginning of a change. And for Deborah, it was the day her fake smile finally shattered. The Atlanta airport was as noisy as ever, but for Nyla Carter, every sound seemed to echo in a separate space. She and her father, Richard Carter, walked out of the security room with curious looks from the surrounding staff. Richard kept his composure, but there was a smoldering fire in his deep eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. But every step he took seemed to create an invisible weight that made others pay attention. As they approached the waiting area, Richard stopped and took out his phone. His voice was low and restrained. "Eleanor, I need you at gate B27. It's an emergency." On the other end of the line, Eleanor Reeves, CEO of Aurora Air, simply replied, "I'm on my way." Nyla looked at her father and asked softly, "Dad, what are you going to do?" Richard sighed, his eyes staring far away through the glass. "It's not about what to do. It's about doing it right. There are things that, if left alone, will continue to consume others." She was silent, but her heart was still shaking. It had all happened so quickly, from a small reminder on the plane to being called to the police. And now, her father was dragging the entire airline system into what seemed like a small misunderstanding. Meanwhile, inside the crew rest area, Deborah Collins sat silently, her hands clasped together. Everything had just happened like a whirlwind. She was called up to explain the whole thing. Alan Brooks, the previous gate supervisor, was also present, his eyes full of disappointment. "I told you not to make a big deal out of it," he said softly. Deborah bit her lip and replied softly, "I was just following the rules." Alan looked at her for a long time, then said slowly, "No, you're following your anger, not the rules." Deborah bowed her head, silent. She felt a rush of heat run down her spine when the loudspeaker blared, "Aurora Air CEO Eleanor Reeves is arriving at gate B27. She knew this was more than just an internal conversation. This was big business. She wondered how things had gotten this far. Just a tote bag, just a young girl. But she still felt threatened, as if the only control she had in her job was about to be taken away. Outside, a crowd of passengers began to gather, Some recognized the girl from the clip they had filmed on the plane. The short video, a few dozen seconds long, was uploaded online, showing Deborah standing over Nyla, her voice angry, while Nyla sat silently, holding her bag. The caption read, "Black college student gets police called on her for a tote bag." Within half an hour, the clip had gone viral. Neela had no idea. She only noticed a few people around her looking at her strangely, some sympathetic, some curious. Richard noticed. He put his hand on his daughter's shoulder and whispered, "Go get some water. I need to talk to them." Nyla nodded and walked to the nearby Starbucks. Every step she took felt like she was walking between two worlds, one where she was just an ordinary student, and the other where she was suddenly the center of a story she didn't want to see. At that moment, Eleanor Reeves appeared. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with silver hair and bright, calm eyes. When she saw Richard waiting, she knew something was serious. They exchanged a brief nod. "Where is she?" Eleanor asked. Richard pointed toward the crew lounge. "Deborah Collins, Chief Stewardess of Flight 662. Eleanor walked, her high heels clicking on the floor, the sound echoing like a heartbeat throughout the area. In the room, Deborah stood up as Eleanor entered. "Madam Reeves," she stammered. "I can explain," Eleanor interrupted, her voice low and clear. "You don't have to explain to me. You just have to explain to yourself." Deborah opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Eleanor looked at her eyes cold but not unkind. "I saw the report. I also saw the passenger video. You weren't just wrong about the rules. You were wrong about your attitude. An airline employee doesn't have the right to make her feelings into rules." Deborah felt the blood drain from her face. I didn't mean to discriminate," Eleanor said slowly. "I'm not saying you did. But the consequences are real, and we have to be responsible for what we do, even if it's unintentional." Alan stood by, head bowed. He looked at Deborah sadly. "I told you to apologize to that girl right away," Deborah said softly. Her voice choked up. "It's too late now." Eleanor put the file down on the table. "Miss Collins, you will be temporarily suspended pending an internal investigation, and I will personally work with the FAA on this incident. You should take some time off." Deborah said nothing. She just nodded. Everything in her mind went blank. Outside, Richard and Eleanor walked out together. He said quietly, "I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but if we don't fix it at the root, it will happen again." Eleanor nodded. "I know. B-32, right?" Richard smiled sadly. "Yes, Gate B-32, where it all started," Eleanor replied. "Then we'll start right there. A new program, a new way of doing things." As they talked, Nyla turned back, her mocha in hand. She saw her father talking to a woman she recognized from the news, the CEO of Aurora Air. She stepped back, not wanting to interrupt, but Eleanor saw. She stepped forward, her voice warm. "You're Neela." "Right. I'm sorry for the terrible experience. Aurora Air owes you an apology." Nyla was a little confused. "I don't want anyone fired for this. I just want to be treated like everyone else." Eleanor looked at her eyes softening. "That's why I'm going to help us change." Nyla didn't understand right away, but in her eyes, she saw something sincere. Meanwhile, outside in the lobby, a few passengers began clapping as the video went viral. One man exclaimed, "Is that Mr. Carter's daughter? Oh my gosh, she's so brave." Word spread quickly, but Richard just held his daughter's hand and whispered, Don't let them make you an icon. Just be yourself. Deborah watched from afar through the glass door as they left. A breeze from the open door blew through her hair. She knew everything had changed forever, but perhaps deep down, she also knew that she needed to change more than anyone else. Nyla and Richard stepped outside, the golden sunlight bathing the runway. The sound of planes taking off echoed. Richard said, "You see, one little thing can make a system shine or break it." "It depends on how we react," Nyla replied softly. "And I think, today, we started doing the right thing." Eleanor stood at the glass door watching them. In her mind, plans for reform were forming. But alongside the numbers and reports, she still remembered the image of the young girl sitting silently with her tote bag. That image would serve as a reminder to all of us that sometimes a person's dignity is more important than a first-class ticket. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the large windows of Aurora Air headquarters. The air in Richard Carter's office was heavy, as if the entire building were holding its breath. He stood by the window, watching the planes roll off the runway. With each takeoff, he felt his heart sink. Aurora Air wasn't just flying today, it was being scrutinized. Last night, a video of Nyla's incident went viral across social media platforms, racking up more than 1 million views in just a few hours. Public opinion was divided, those who condemned the discrimination, those who said it was an exaggerated misunderstanding. The phone rang. Richard picked it up. Eleanor Reeves's voice came through, cold and quick. "We have a big problem. The news agencies are calling. CNN, The Washington Post, even Fox. They want to interview her, your daughter." Richard sighed, his voice slowing. "She's only 19. Eleanor, she doesn't need to be a symbol." Eleanor replied, "I know, but this has gone beyond the company. We need to control the story before it controls us." Richard was silent. He knew she was right. He looked down at the table, where Nyla's phone was glowing with dozens of messages. She was still asleep in the small living room next door, exhausted from the long night. As he looked at her, curled up on the sofa, he felt a mixture of pity and pride. A moment later, Nyla woke up. She heard the morning news on the television. The screen showed her in video sitting still, clutching her bag, her eyes worried. Below, the text read, "Flight 662. Incident Aurora Air accused of discrimination." Nyla looked at her father and said softly, "I don't want them to see me like this." Richard walked over and put his hand on her shoulder. "I know, but you can't avoid this. How you face it will determine what they see, victim or hero." Meanwhile, in her small apartment south of Atlanta, Deborah Collins sat at the kitchen table, clutching a cup of coffee. Her phone screen showed the same news. She saw herself in the video, a frown, a harsh voice. Below were thousands of comments, many of them angry. This is why people are afraid to fly Aurora Air. She should be fired immediately. Racism disguised as regulation. Deborah turned off the screen and sat in silence for a long time. Richard's words echoed in her head. "Are you enforcing the rules or asserting your power?" She had asked herself that question dozens of times, and each time the answer stung. The door suddenly opened. The elderly neighbor, Mrs. Louise, came in carrying a loaf of bread. "Deborah, are you okay?" Deborah tried to smile. "I'm alive, Mrs." Louise put the bread on the table and looked at her closely. "I saw the news. Everyone said you were wrong. But do you know what makes me sadder? That you didn't speak up. If you know you're wrong, say so. If you feel misunderstood, Say so. Silence is sometimes worse than being wrong. Deborah sat still. She knew she was right. She had been silent for too long, both in work and in life. She had never dared to react when a customer insulted her, nor had she dared to cry when a coworker took advantage of her. It was only when she saw the girl looking straight at her, calm and silent, that she realized her own helplessness, and she had taken it out on the wrong person. In the main office, Eleanor was preparing for an emergency board meeting. On the big screen were viral posts. The hashtag Marsha Tote Bag Girl was trending at the top of Twitter. She looked at Richard. If we don't handle it right, the stock will drop this week. But if we do it right, this could be an opportunity to redefine Aurora Air. Richard nodded. I don't want to turn this into a PR stunt. I just want the truth to be told. Eleanor smiled, then let her speak. That afternoon, Neela agreed to a short live interview. The camera turned to her. The host smiled slightly. Neela, how do you feel when people call you the new anti-discrimination icon? Neela bowed her head slightly, her voice soft but clear. I don't want to be an icon. I just want to be treated like a normal person. I don't want anyone to have to go through what I felt that day, and being looked at as if they did something wrong, while just sitting still. The studio was silent for a few seconds. Then the host whispered, That's the most beautiful answer I've ever heard. On the other side of the screen, Deborah sat watching, her eyes red. As Nyla spoke, a tear fell. She knew it was time to do the right thing. That evening, as Nyla and her father were having dinner in the apartment, the doorbell rang. Richard answered it, and he froze. Standing before him was Deborah Collins, her face weary, her eyes sincere. I know this isn't the best time, she said, her voice trembling, but I need to see Nyla. Richard looked at his daughter, then nodded, stepping aside to let them talk. Deborah stepped in and stood in front of Nyla. She took a deep breath. I have no excuse. I was wrong. I let my anger and exhaustion get the best of me. I'm sorry I scared you. And I'm sorry I made others think they had the right to do the same. I'm really sorry. Neela looked at her. There was no hatred in the young girl's eyes, only sadness and a little sympathy. I don't hate you, she said softly. I just hope that after this, you remember that no one should be considered guilty because of the color of their skin or their silence. Deborah nodded slightly, tears rolling down her face. Thank you. Today, you probably taught me something I never learned in my entire life, how to listen. Richard stood still, watching the conversation. He saw two generations, two people, one who had been swallowed by the system and one who was breaking it. In that moment, he knew the best thing to do was let them speak for themselves. After Deborah left, Nyla turned to her father, her voice quiet. Do things sometimes happen to remind us of something important? Richard smiled slightly, looking at his daughter. Maybe so. Not all lessons come from pleasant places. Outside the window, the Atlanta night sky was lit up by city lights. In Aurora Air headquarters, Eleanor was writing a new internal memo starting tomorrow. Aurora Air will launch a Listen First training program. Listen first, judge later. Every passenger is a person, not a number on a list, somewhere, amidst the noise of the world. Nyla Carter, the girl who got the police called over a tote bag, finally found her voice. And that voice, soft but resonant, made the entire system stop and listen. It's been a week since the Flight 662 video went viral. What was once an isolated incident has become a national media sensation. People have dubbed it variously the tote bag incident, Aurora Air apology. And one newspaper even called it the day America paused to listen. Online, thousands of people have shared their own stories of being treated unfairly because of their race, gender, or status. From a short video, a national conversation about understanding and compassion began. In the Carters' small apartment in downtown Atlanta, the morning was much calmer than the previous week. Nyla sat on the balcony, a hot cup of coffee in front of her and her laptop open. Her inbox was flooded with messages from strangers. Some offered words of encouragement. Others said they had experienced similar experiences. She read each line with a sinking heart. Each story was a mirror of a silent pain she had never known before. Richard walked out, newspaper in hand. He placed the Atlantic in front of her. On the front page was a picture of Nyla, smiling slightly. Under it was a large headline, "The Girl Who Made America Listen." She sighed softly. "Dad, I don't want to be famous." Richard smiled, his voice warm. "You don't need to be famous to change things. You just need to be real." That made her sit still. Perhaps the most important thing is not to be an icon, but to live up to what you believe. Across town, Deborah Collins received a call from the Aurora Air office. Eleanor Reeves' voice came through the phone. "Deborah, I read the final report. You're not fired, but I want you to be part of the Listen First program we're starting. Not as a victim, but as a mentor." Deborah was silent for a few seconds, then said softly, "I'm not sure I'm worthy," Eleanor replied. "Because you think so? You're the best person." After hanging up, Deborah sat still for a long time. The sunlight streamed through the small window, illuminating her tired but gradually brightening face. She remembered the evening she had come to apologize to Nyla. She remembered the gentle look in the young girl's eyes as she said, "I don't hate you." And for the first time in years, Deborah found herself wanting to do the right thing, not to save her job, but to save herself. At Aurora Air headquarters, the Listen First project was launched. The first training sessions took place in a solemn atmosphere. Deborah stood in front of the group of new employees, her voice calm. "I used to think that when I put on this uniform, I had to be strong. I had to control everything. But actually, sometimes, being strong is having the courage to listen and admit when you are wrong." The room was silent. A young employee raised her hand and asked Ms. Cohens, "What made you change?" Deborah smiled, her eyes slightly moist. "A young girl taught me that." She didn't need to scream or protest. She just needed to stay calm, and I heard the truth in her silence. At another press conference, Eleanor Reeves appeared with Richard Carter. She announced a new training program that would be implemented across the Aurora Air system and extended to partner airlines. "A small incident doesn't have to be the end of the world," she said. "Sometimes it's the beginning of something better." Richard stood by, proud but humble. He knew that what was happening was more than just a management exercise. It was a journey of healing for the company, for his daughter, and for people like Deborah. As the press conference ended, a reporter approached Nyla and asked, "How do you feel about Aurora Air using your story as a platform for change?" She replied quietly, "I'm just one person in millions. If my story makes someone else feel better, then everything I went through was worth it." That evening, as Nyla and Richard dined together at a small restaurant in the city, they heard the sound of television from a nearby table. A news anchor was saying, "After Aurora Air, a bunch of other companies are implementing similar programs to train their employees on empathy and fairness in customer service. They call it the tote bag effect." Richard chuckled. "See, That little bag has become a symbol of change." Nyla laughed too, but there was something deep in her eyes. "Dad, I don't think it's about the bag. It's about how we treat each other." Meanwhile, at home, Deborah opened her laptop and watched a video of Nyla's speech at a student conference where she had just been invited as a guest of honor. On stage, Nyla told hundreds of young people, "None of us can change the world in a day, but we can choose to change the way we see others. Sometimes, just a second of listening can prevent a tragedy." Deborah smiled, tears falling again. She pressed the share button on the video, adding a line, "Thank you for making me listen." The next day, the hashtag #NoRoListenFirst went viral. People started sharing their stories, a taxi driver apologizing to a passenger for being rude, a store clerk listening to an elderly customer's story, a teacher changing her teaching style after a student shared her feelings. They all wrote the same sentence. It started with a girl on Flight 662. That weekend, Neela, Richard, and Eleanor were invited to Washington to receive the Humanity and Service Award. When Nyla stepped up to the podium to accept the award, the audience stood up and applauded. She said simply, "I don't want anyone to be afraid of just living right. We can't heal the past, but we can start by listening to each other today." After the ceremony, Eleanor stood next to Richard and said softly, "Do you realize that it was her silence that made the world speak?" Richard smiled, looking at his daughter, who was smiling at everyone. "Yes, sometimes the strongest thing in the world is calmness." That night, they returned to the hotel. Neela stood on the balcony, the breeze blowing gently, the city lights twinkling below. She looked up at the sky, where planes were flying. She thought of her mother, who had taught her that kindness was not a weakness. Then she thought of Deborah, of Eleanor, of all the people who had changed with her. A tear fell, but this time it was of gratitude. On the other side of the country, Deborah also looked up at the sky, seeing an Aurora airplane fly by. She smiled slightly. "Safe flight," she whispered, as if to herself. Their story, a girl, a father, a woman who made a mistake, and a company that listens, has become proof that sometimes just a small action can create an unexpected wave of change. The ripple effect started with a tote bag, but ended up igniting kindness in millions of hearts. It was a quiet night in Washington, a breeze blowing through the hotel curtains, a soft light illuminating the room where Nyla sat alone at her desk. The awards ceremony had ended hours ago, but she still hadn't slept. Everything had happened so quickly it was hard to believe. The girl who had once been called on a tote bag was now standing on stage, being honored for spreading kindness. She didn't see herself as a hero. She saw herself as someone who had been afraid, who had cried alone in a cold airport security room, and who had chosen not to let that fear define her. Before her was a blank sheet of paper. She intended to write a letter, not to anyone in particular, maybe to herself, to her mother, to the hurt people she had never met. She put down the pen, and the first lines appeared. To the girl who sat there that day, holding her tote bag and trying not to cry. She did well. She didn't have to explain herself to anyone. She just needed to remember that kindness is not weakness, and her silence can make the world listen. She paused, her eyes welling up. An image of her mother appeared in her mind, her gentle face and warm voice. "You can't control how others see you, but you can control how you react." Those words had guided her through her darkest days. She continued, "Don't let one bad moment make you think the world is all bad. Sometimes The person who hurt you is hurting in ways you don't know. Forgiveness is not to give them peace, but to help you move on more easily. Outside the door, Richard Carter knocked softly. "Are you still awake?" "Yes. I'm almost done." He walked in, 2 cups of hot cocoa in hand. He placed one in front of his daughter, looking at the paper she was writing on. "Writing a diary again." Nyla smiled. "No, it's a letter, but I don't think I'll send it anywhere." Richard sat down, his eyes gentle. "So what do you write about?" "To remember and to forget. There are things that you only understand how strong they make you when you write them down." Richard was silent, then said, "You know, I used to think that being strong meant being confrontational, but you taught me that sometimes being strong means being gentle." He chuckled. "I'm proud of you." Nyla felt a stinging sensation in her nose as she leaned her head on her father's shoulder, feeling the familiar warmth. In that moment, all the noise outside seemed to disappear. The next morning, Nyla woke up early. She took the note, folded it carefully, and put it in her pocket. She and her father would fly back to Atlanta today. When they arrived at the airport, a young Aurora Air employee recognized them. She smiled brightly. "Hello, Nyla. I am participating in the Listen First program. Your story is very inspiring." Nyla was surprised, then smiled and replied, "Thank you. Just remember to listen to others. That is enough." As they boarded the plane, Nyla paused. Her seat was row 14C. She froze for a few seconds. Richard noticed and whispered, "Is this coincidence or fate?" She smiled slightly and sat down. It felt different than last time. There was still the sound of the engines, the soft lights, but no more fear, just peace and gratitude. A moment later, a flight attendant walked in. It was Deborah Collins. She was wearing a new uniform, looking more relaxed, her eyes warm. When she saw Nyla, she paused for a moment, then smiled. "What a coincidence. I didn't think I'd see you on this flight." Nyla smiled, her voice light as the wind. "I didn't think so either." Deborah bowed her head slightly. "Thank you for your forgiveness. I'm trying to be a better person every day," Nyla replied. "I know. We're all learning." Deborah left, leaving Nyla in a strange peace. As the plane took off, she looked out the window, sunlight shining on the paper in her hand. She unfolded it, adding a few final lines. "To everyone who has ever been misunderstood, or judged by the color of their skin, or the way they look, or the voice they speak, remember that your worth is not on how others see you, but in how you see yourself. And no matter how loud the world gets, find a quiet corner to listen to your heart." She folded it and put it in her purse. She might never send the letter, but she knew that somehow it was already out there, in every word, every action, every smile. The plane shuddered as it passed through the clouds. Richard turned to her and asked, "How does it feel to be flying again?" Nyla looked out, a smile flickering across her face. "I feel free." He smiled, and peaceful, both. In the forward cabin, Deborah watched them. She felt a strange emotion well up inside her. For the first time in years, she truly loved her job, not for the uniform, but for the opportunity to meet people who would teach her how to be better. When the plane landed in Atlanta, the sky was a brilliant blue. Passengers stood up, preparing to leave their seats. Deborah opened the door, her voice soft. "Thank you for flying with Aurora Air. Have a nice day." Nyla stood up, turned to look at her, and nodded slightly. In that moment, They both knew it was over, not with bitterness, but with forgiveness. "What are you going to do next?" Richard asked as they left the airport. Nyla smiled, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "Maybe I'll write, not letters, but stories that no one has heard. There are many people who are still silent, and I want to help them be heard." Richard looked at his daughter, a proud smile on his face. "My daughter, you have the heart of a healer." That evening, in her small apartment, Neela placed the letter on her desk, next to a photo of herself with her parents. She lit a candle, its small flame flickering against the wall. She didn't mail the letter. She just left it there, as a reminder that sometimes the things left unsaid are the ones that touch the deepest. She looked out the window and saw an Aurora airplane flying through the night sky, its lights twinkling among the stars. She smiled. Somewhere, someone might be reading a story like hers and feeling comforted. Maybe someone was choosing to listen instead of judge. And just like that, her unsent letter had served its purpose, healing without words. The Atlanta morning began with soft sunlight streaming through the windows of Nyla Carter's small apartment. The city was waking up, traffic spilling onto the main roads. In the kitchen, Richard Carter was making coffee, the strong aroma filling the room. He looked into the living room, where Neela sat at her computer, her eyes focused, her face strangely peaceful. She was editing the first draft of a new podcast she called The Sound of Listening. It wasn't a show about herself, but a space for others. She wanted to listen to those who had been silenced, those who had been judged, misunderstood, or simply not given the chance to tell their stories. "I don't plan to say too much in it," she once told her father. "I just want to ask questions and let them talk. I want people to feel the silence between the stories." The first recording session took place in a small room with only a microphone, some acoustic foam, and warm lighting. Her first guest was a white Uber driver named Michael, who had been accused of being rude to black customers, but was actually suffering from depression after losing his wife. When he spoke, his voice trembling, "I don't hate anyone. I just don't know how to talk anymore." Neela just sat there, nodding. Occasionally, she would say, "I understand," and stay silent so he could continue. When the session ended, Michael chuckled, his eyes softening. "I think this is the first time I've actually been heard." That night, Neela turned on the computer and adjusted the volume. When she heard Michael say, "I just don't know how to talk anymore," she suddenly felt a lump in her throat. She remembered Deborah, remembered the moment on the plane. If she had reacted differently that day, perhaps things would not be like this. But she understood. Sometimes it was those collisions that created change. A month later, The Sound of Listening became Spotify's most listened to podcast in the humanities. Thousands of people left comments. "I cried when I listened to episode 3. I saw myself in that woman's story." Thank you, Neela, for making us want to listen more. At Aurora Air headquarters, Eleanor Reeves was watching a media briefing. She looked at Naila's picture on the screen and smiled. "Richard, your little girl just made the impossible happen," she said over the phone. Richard replied softly but proudly, "I think she's just doing what she was born to do." One rainy afternoon, Deborah Collins stumbled upon Nyla's latest podcast while cleaning her office. Nyla's voice came softly through the speakers. Sometimes listening doesn't mean agreeing. It means acknowledging the other person's existence. That made Deborah pause. She turned off the vacuum cleaner and stood still in the empty room, her eyes watering. For so long, she had tried to fix herself by talking, by teaching. But perhaps what she needed most was silence and listening. She opened her phone and typed a short text message. I listened. Thank you. Then she sent it to Neela. That evening, when Neela received the message, she smiled. Without further ado, the 3 words I heard made all the effort worthwhile. She replied, "Thank you for not giving up." One weekend morning, Nyla was invited to a panel discussion at her old college, where she had studied communications. The auditorium was packed with students. The host asked, "What makes you believe that listening can change the world?" She thought for a moment and then replied, "Because when you listen, you make people feel alive, and when people are seen, they are less likely to hurt others." The room fell silent. Then there was a long applause. After the discussion, a white female student came up to her, her voice trembling. "Miss Nyla, I was a witness to my mother being humiliated because of her appearance. I was silent, but after hearing your story, I told my best friend that I was wrong for not speaking up. I just want to thank you." Neela gently touched the girl's shoulder, smiling. "Thank you for being brave." That night, Neela went home and played the new podcast episode. She decided to add an epilogue. The sound of listening is not a voice, but a silence between 2 people, where there is no judgment, only understanding. Richard walked up behind her, listening quietly as she read the last few sentences. When she paused, he said, "You know, you just said something that takes people a lifetime to understand." She turned to him, smiling gently. "Dad, maybe it's because I was the one who wasn't listened to." He nodded. "And now I'm the one who makes others listen. That's the best thing." The next day, Aurora Air launched its new advertising campaign. It wasn't about fancy videos or fancy planes. It was about real audio recordings of passengers recounting small moments when they felt heard from flight attendants, apologizing to passengers helping each other stow their bags. The tagline at the end of the video read, "Aurora Air, because every voice matters." Deborah also appears in that video. She recounts in her real voice, "I made mistakes, but I was lucky because someone taught me how to listen. Now, every time I serve a passenger, I always remember her words. See the person, not the problem." The video went viral, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. One evening, as Neela sat on the balcony looking out at the city lights, Richard brought out 2 cups of tea. "Do you remember how it felt the first time you sat in seat 14C?" she asked, smiling softly, her eyes distant. "I do. But now that I think about it, I don't feel scared anymore. I just feel grateful." Richard put his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "That's when you know you've truly forgiven." She looked up at the sky, where an Aurora airplane was flying, its taillights twinkling against the night sky. Her voice was small but clear. "Every sound counts, Dad. Even silence." He smiled, a proud smile. "And you have made your silence the most beautiful sound." In the small apartment, the soundtrack from a new podcast plays in the background. Neela's voice is warm and slow. This is not a story about a tote bag or a flight. This is a story about how we learn to listen, to love more, to understand each other better, and sometimes just stopping for a second can change the world. The sound spread out, blending into the sleeping city, gentle yet profound. A sound that was not loud, not fierce, but enough to move millions of hearts, the sound of listening. It was a quiet Saturday morning. Atlanta bathed in soft sunlight and the sound of birds chirping mixed with the distant sound of cars. In a small apartment on the 14th floor, Nyla Carter sat before the microphone, preparing to record the final episode of The Sound of Listening. This familiar room had witnessed dozens of stories told, cries, laughter, and moments of silence that made people think. On the table, a cup of tea still steamed slightly. The clock said 9. Richard Carter walked in, holding a newspaper, smiling. Ready for the final episode? She looked up, her eyes gentle. I don't know, Dad. It feels like I'm saying goodbye to a friend. He sat down opposite, his voice warm. The things that really matter never disappear. Neela. They just change form to continue living. Nyla nodded, pressing the record button. She took a deep breath, her voice coming through the microphone, as soft and genuine as the first day. Welcome to the final episode of The Sound of Listening. I don't have a guest today. I just want to tell you a little story. A story that begins on a plane, with a tote bag, and a young girl who didn't know that her silence would cause the whole world to stop and listen. She paused for a few seconds, closing her eyes as if reliving that moment. Her voice continued. Low and steady, I used to think silence was weakness, that if I didn't fight back, others would think I was wrong. But that day, as I sat in the cold security room, I realized that calmness is not surrender. It is the strength of belief, believing that the truth does not need to be shouted to be heard. Richard sat beside her, silently watching her daughter. He knew she was telling the story not only to others, but also to herself. Nyla continued, I met that flight attendant again, Deborah Collins. We talked like friends. And I realized, sometimes the people who hurt us are just learning to love. When you have the courage to listen, you can see the fear behind the anger, the sadness behind the coldness. And when you see that, all the resentment melts away. There was a long pause. She smiled slightly. Actually, I have never said this in public. That day, when I left the airport, I did not feel like a winner. I just felt empty. But a few days later, I received a letter from a 12-year-old girl. She wrote that her friends had laughed at her for being black. And when she saw me stay calm, she understood that she did not need to apologize for the color of her skin. That letter saved me. Before I knew it, Nyla's voice cracked a little, but she didn't stop. I want to say to everyone listening, you don't have to do something big to change the world. Just listening to someone, honestly, can change a day in their life. And maybe your life. In the corner of the room. Richard raised his head slightly, his eyes moist. He remembered his daughter's journey, from a frightened little girl to a woman who could make a country listen. He felt a surge of gratitude. Nyla stopped recording, but she didn't turn off the phone. She looked out the window, where the light was illuminating the photo of her and her mother. In the frame, the woman smiled gently. She whispered, Mom, I did it. That afternoon, Nyla took the final recording to the local radio station where the program would be broadcast for the first time. The station was in an old building with red brick walls and a warm smell of old wood and coffee. The host, Mr. Miller, a white man with silver hair, shook her hand. I heard the first part. Neela, your voice really touched the heart. She smiled. Thank you. I just said what I felt. As the recording played, the city slowed down. Drivers tuned in. Corner cafes opened. And at home. Deborah Collins listened quietly from her Bluetooth speaker. When Nyla's voice finally spoke the final line, we can't change what happened, but we can choose to listen to each other today. Deborah wept softly. She placed her hand over her heart and whispered, Thank you for not staying silent forever. That evening, Richard and Nyla sat on the roof, the wind blowing gently. He asked, Do you feel empty when it's over? Nyla thought for a moment and replied, Not really. I feel like I do at the end of a long flight. Tired, emotional, but also at peace, because I know I landed safely. Richard smiled, his voice full of warmth. And you will always be the captain of your life. Neela. She laughed, then looked up silently at the sky. A plane flew by, its lights flashing in the night sky. She said softly, Dad, do you think people will remember this story for long? It doesn't matter how long they remember. He replied, What matters is that while they're listening, their hearts change. She nodded, understanding every word. The next day, major newspapers ran articles about the final episode of The Sound of Listening. One headline read, When Silence Becomes the Music of Understanding. It was written that no show had ever made so many listeners cry silently. That evening, Nyla received an email from Eleanor Reeves. She wrote, Aurora Air is expanding the Listen First program to other countries. Thank you for your inspiration. The world needs more people like you. Neela read it and smiled. She didn't reply, just saved the email as a souvenir. At the end of the rebroadcast, Neela added a short note, her voice deep and resonant. I'm not special. I'm just a girl who was wronged and chose not to respond with anger. If there's anything I want you to remember, it's this: every time you listen to someone, you let them know they're worth living, and that's the greatest gift we can give each other. When the episode ended, viewers left thousands of comments, not compliments, but real stories, family reconciliations, apologies spoken, smiles returning after years of silence. In her small apartment, Nyla turned off the microphone and looked out the window, the nightlight illuminating her face. She no longer felt like the girl on Flight 66-2. Now, she was the narrator for thousands of other voices, voices that had been forgotten, and that was what made her feel truly free. Richard stepped forward and placed his hand on her shoulder. You know, sometimes the greatest thing we can do is not to talk, but to make others want to talk. She smiled and replied softly, and want to listen. Dad. The wind blew through the window, carrying the echoes of untold stories under the night sky. Atlanta glowed. Somewhere, someone heard her voice on the radio, smiling. No more tears, no more anger, just peace. A peace made of the sounds of humanity. The sound of listening ends, but Nyla Carter's journey continues not on the radio, but in the hearts of those who have learned to listen. A week after the final episode of The Sound of Listening aired, Nyla Carter's small apartment was flooded with morning light. Multicolored envelopes were stacked 2 feet high on the desk. Next to her was an open laptop, her email inbox displaying more than 1,000 unread messages. All had the same subject line. Thank you, Neela. She sat down and opened the first letter, her hands shaking slightly. Her voice resonated softly as she read aloud, as if addressing her audience. Dear Nyla, I am a nurse in Texas. During the 2 years of the pandemic, I felt numb to my emotions. But when you said that listening is an act of love, I burst into tears. I realized I had stopped listening to my patients. The next day, I went back to the hospital and just sat and listened to an elderly man tell a story for 20 minutes. He laughed, and I laughed. Thank you for reminding me who I am. She put the letter down gently, tears rolling down her face. There was something real in those scribbles, a sincerity that surpassed any article or award. Richard walked in and saw his daughter reading the letter. He smiled. It looks like your program is doing its job, healing. Neela looked up, her voice still filled with emotion. Dad, I never thought the little things I said could touch so many people." He put his hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, just a soft voice is enough to make the world quiet." She continued to open more letters. Another, written in shaky handwriting. "Neela, I am a single mother who lost my son to school violence. I resented the whole world. But when I heard you talk about forgiveness, I called the mother of the boy who took my son away. We cried together. No one won, but at least we no longer held grudges." Nyla folded the letter and pressed her hand to her chest. A warm feeling spread through her. Not because she was a hero, but because she understood that some words travel farther than the one who says them. That afternoon, Deborah Collins called. Her voice was soft and deep. "Nyla, I want you to know that your program was broadcast during Aurora Air Training. The room fell silent when you said, 'Look at the person, not the problem.' A young flight attendant stood up and said, 'I want to be like Nyla.' I thought you should know that." Nyla laughed softly, her eyes still sparkling. "Thank you, Deborah. You're the one who made me believe that anyone can change." "On the other end of the line," Deborah replied, her voice trembling. "No, you're the one who made me want to change." That night, Neela sat on the sofa, looking at the letters scattered around. She turned on her computer, created a new folder, and named it The Letters That Heard. She began retyping each letter, adding little notes next to them. Texas nurse, renewed faith. Single mother, reconciliation. Young flight attendant, new hope. She knew what she would do next. The next day, she met Richard at the usual coffee shop. He looked at her knowingly. "What are you planning?" "I want to put them into a book," she said. "Not to tell my story, but to preserve the voices of others. I want each chapter to be a story delivered, unedited, unjudgmented." Richard smiled. "A book of voices. It sounds like you." As they spoke, a middle-aged woman at the next table turned around. "Excuse me, are you Nyla Carter?" Nyla nodded, slightly surprised. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman continued. "I listen to your show every morning while driving. It makes me calmer and less irritable with my teenage daughter." Then she smiled, her eyes lighting up. "She told me that her mommy sounds like Neela now. That's the biggest compliment I've ever received." As the woman left, Richard looked at his daughter and shook his head slightly. "See? You created a chain reaction of listening." Nyla laughed, but deep inside she was filled with emotion. That evening, she wrote to Eleanor Reeves, "Thank you for believing that a bad moment can be turned into a good lesson. Thank you for not hiding it, but facing it. Aurora Air not only changed the airline industry, but also changed the way people talk to each other." Eleanor read the letter in her office, the wind blowing through the large glass windows. She looked out at the runway where planes were preparing to take off. She said softly, "Every good journey begins with listening." 2 months later, Nyla's book was released, titled Letters from the Listeners. The cover was simple, a white background, a small image of an old microphone, and the words, "Every sound is a beating heart." At the book launch, Nyla stood on a small stage, warm lights shining down. The hundreds of people in the audience fell silent as she opened with the words, "I didn't write this book. You wrote it. I'm just the one recording the voice of humanity." In the middle of the ceremony, a woman stood up and took the microphone. It was Deborah. She said, her voice choked up, "I was the one who made Nyla cry, but today I stand here because she made me love again." The whole room applauded. Nyla walked down and hugged Deborah. The flashing lights seemed to capture a moment of complete healing. At the end of the show, Richard took the stage. He spoke slowly over the years. I learned this from my daughter, that sometimes you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to speak from your heart. The audience rose to their feet, and there was a thunderous applause. When night fell, Neela returned to her apartment. She opened the window. A gentle breeze blew in, carrying the scent of jasmine from the balcony. On the table was a pile of new letters that continued to arrive every day. She sat down and opened an envelope. Inside was a small note hastily written, "Miss Nyla, today I apologize to someone I haven't spoken to in 10 years. I just wanted you to know that." She smiled, folded the letter, and placed it beside the others. In the corner of the room, the old microphone lay still. She touched it gently and said softly, as if in greeting, "Thank you for letting me hear the world." Outside, the city was still bustling, but in that room, there was only peace. And somewhere in the night, a radio voice came back on, playing the first episode of The Sound of Listening. Nyla's voice echoed, "We can't change everything, but we can start by listening." A soft sound, but enough to make thousands of hearts flutter. 6 months after the release of Letters from the Listeners, Nyla Carter received a special invitation from Aurora Air. The email read just a few lines. "We are taking Flight 662 on our anniversary flight, the flight where it all began. We want you to be our guest of honor. We will be recording a special episode of The Sound of Listening on that flight." Neela read it over and over again. Even though she had been through everything, just hearing the number 6E62 still made her heart tremble slightly. Not out of fear, but a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. She smiled slightly, replying to the email with just 3 words, "I agree." That day, the Atlanta sky was blue. Neela walked into the airport, a sense of familiarity rushing back. She remembered every corner, every loudspeaker announcement, the smell of coffee, the sound of hurried footsteps. But this time was different. She was no longer the scared girl sitting in the security line. She was someone who had learned that calmness is the softest, most enduring strength. Richard Carter walked with her, holding her hand, his voice soft. "I think you should fly alone. Neela, you need to close this story on your own terms." She looked at him, then nodded slightly. "You're right, but I promise I'll wait for you at the finish line." Richard smiled. "Always." When she reached the departure gate, a woman dressed in Aurora Air uniform came out to greet her. "Ms. Carter, it's a pleasure to meet you." Nyla was surprised. It was Deborah Collins. The woman who had brought her to tears was now standing before her with a genuine smile. "I heard you were flying today. I asked to be your flight attendant. I wanted to personally welcome you back." Neela was silent for a few seconds, then replied softly, "Thank you, Deborah. I'm so glad you're here." They looked at each other. No words needed. They both understood that this moment was more than just a flight, but a symbol of complete forgiveness. As the plane began to taxi, Nyla gently placed a small microphone on the folding table. She was preparing to record a special episode called The Return Flight. Her voice rang out, slow and gentle. "Welcome to a special episode of The Sound of Listening. Today, I am sitting on Flight 6062, where it all began, and where I learned that sometimes silence can say more than 1,000 words." She looked out the window at the white clouds drifting by. Her voice continued, "I am no longer angry when I think back to that day. On the contrary, I feel grateful, because if it weren't for that moment, I wouldn't have understood that listening not only saves others, but also saves myself. Meanwhile, Deborah walked by, her eyes sparkling. She paused, placing a cup of tea in front of Nyla. "Jasmine tea, as you like," she said. Nyla smiled and softly replied, "Thank you." Nyla's voice on the recording continues, light as a breeze. "Sitting here, I think of all the people who have written to me. Nurses, mothers, airline workers, people who have felt forgotten. I realize everyone has their own voice. If only someone would listen, they would begin to heal." The cabin was quiet. Many passengers were listening quietly to Aurora Air's invitation. The small radio on the plane was playing excerpts from her show. Neela's voice rang out over the engine noise. "Every journey has a beginning. For me, it was Flight 602. But for you, it might be the moment you choose not to judge someone, or the moment you listen to a story to the end." A young passenger sitting near the window, a white blonde girl, turned to Nyla and said, "You're Nyla Carter, right? I just wanted to say, I listened to your show. It made me apologize to my mom after all these years of not talking." Nyla smiled, her eyes warm. "It's great. Sometimes just a little conversation is enough to start over." The flight lasted more than 2 hours, and all the while, Neela recorded and listened to the sounds of the engines, people talking, and small laughter mixed in. Each sound carried life, a connection. As the plane began to descend, Deborah came to her and said softly, "I still have the note you wrote that day. I read it whenever I feel discouraged." Nyla looked at her, moved. "I still have your letter, too. It seems we both learned something from that day." Deborah nodded, her eyes moist. "If I hadn't made a mistake that day, maybe I wouldn't have understood the value of listening. Maybe every mistake has a reason to exist." Neela gently touched her shoulder. "That's right. As long as we don't let it become our final definition." As the plane touched down, passengers applauded. The cabin lights came on, and Deborah's voice blared through the loudspeakers. "We thank you for being on Aurora Flight 662, a journey of listening." Many looked around, their eyes sparkling with emotion. Nyla turned off the recorder and sat still for a few seconds. She looked out the window and saw her father's shadow at the gate to greet her. She took a deep breath, then stood up and walked downstairs. Richard hugged her tightly. "You did it," he whispered. "You didn't just fly back. You landed safely." Neela smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And I think, this time, I didn't fly just for myself." They stepped outside, where the sunset was painting the tarmac a golden hue. The wind blew, carrying the echoes of a loudspeaker, a snippet from her program that had just been broadcast system-wide. "On Aurora Air, listening doesn't weaken you. It makes you more human." Neela paused, looking up at the sky where Flight 662 was taking off for its next flight. She smiled, her eyes sparkling. In her heart, there was a sense of closure, but also another door opening. She knew that the journey of listening never stopped. It just changed form, from sound to action, from one person to another. That evening, when she returned home, Nyla played the recording she had made on the flight. Her voice was deep and warm. This is a special episode of The Sound of Listening. I am sitting in the sky, where it all begins. And if you are listening to this, I just want to say one thing. Thank you for listening to me and listening to yourself. Richard sat next to her, smiling gently. "You know, if your mother were still alive, she would be so proud." Nella looked out the window, where the moonlight reflected off the wings of the passing plane, and whispered, "I think she's listening. Dad." There was a long silence, but no longer sadness. Only the gentle sounds of life remained, the sounds of forgiveness, of love, and of hearts that had learned to listen. It was early fall in Atlanta, and the soft yellow sunlight poured down on the red-leafed streets. Neela Carter sat by the window in her small apartment, a steaming cup of jasmine tea rising from her cup, the familiar sound of the radio playing from the corner of her desk. It had been 3 months since she finished the last episode of The Sound of Listening, but her voice still appeared regularly in community programs. She was no longer the girl behind the microphone telling stories. Now she was the one standing in front of the class, teaching others how to listen. Today's conference room is in an old brick building, its large windows opening onto a lush garden. More than 30 people sit in a circle. Some are teachers, some are healthcare workers, some are just parents trying to talk to their children again. On the board is written in white chalk, "Listen not to answer, but to understand." Neela walked in, her hair tied back, her face a peaceful expression. "Hello, everyone," she said, her voice soft and resonant. "Before we begin, I want you to close your eyes. Don't think about anything. Just listen. Listen to the fan. Listen to your breathing. Listen to the person sitting next to you. When you really listen, you'll realize you're not alone." The room fell silent, a minute, then 2, until Nyla softly said, "Okay, open your eyes." Many people smiled. A few quietly wiped away tears. A middle-aged man raised his hand and said softly, "I never realized how peaceful silence could be." Nyla nodded and replied, "Sometimes you just need to be quiet to listen to yourself." After class, she stood by the door, watching everyone leave. A young girl approached and said, "Miss Nyla, my mother listened to your program. The other day, she told me that you helped her forgive my father. I don't know what to say other than thank you." Nyla held the girl's hand and smiled lightly. "No need to thank me. Let's continue listening to each other. That's enough." In the afternoon, she returned to the apartment. Richard Carter was sitting on the sofa, reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled. "How was class today?" "It was great, Dad," she replied, pouring more tea. "I find that the more I teach, the more I learn. Everyone has a story, and when they tell it, I see a part of myself in it." He nodded. "That sounds like your mother. She used to say that teaching others to love is the way to keep yourself from forgetting to love." They were silent for a moment. The old microphone was still on the table, like a souvenir. Richard looked at it and asked, "You're not going to record anymore?" Neela smiled slightly. "Yes, but not the show anymore. I want to make a series of short videos, telling little stories about kindness. I want to spread that to people who have never heard the sound of listening." He smiled, his eyes full of pride. "My daughter has never stopped halfway." A few weeks later, Nyla's series of videos appeared on social media. In the first, she sat in a small room, yellow light streaming through the windows, her voice as soft as a breeze. If you think no one is listening to you, try listening to someone. You'll see. Sometimes. Understanding begins with the giver. The video was only 3 minutes long, but it attracted millions of views. The comments were filled with real stories from people who had been silent for too long, but now began to share. One evening, while she was editing a new video, the phone rang. It was Eleanor Reeves. "Neela, I have an invitation," she said. Aurora Air has partnered with an international organization on the Listening Without Borders program. We want you to be an ambassador. Nayla paused. You want me to teach listening? On a global level, Eleanor smiled. Not just teach, but inspire. You are proof that one small voice can change the world. A few weeks later, Nayla flew to Geneva, Switzerland, to attend a conference. The large auditorium was filled with hundreds of people from different countries. As she stepped onto the stage, the lights dimmed. She sensed the room was waiting. She began to speak, her voice slow and full of sincerity. I am not an expert. I am just a girl who has been misunderstood, who has chosen silence over anger, and I have discovered that, in this noisy world, listening is a form of courage. The room fell silent. Then she continued, if we could listen to each other more, maybe there would be less pain in the world. Maybe instead of arguing, we would ask, why do you feel that way? Maybe instead of judging, we would say, I'm listening. When she finished, hundreds of people stood up and applauded, many in tears. Eleanor stepped forward to hug her and whispered, thank you. Nayla, you remind us that kindness never goes out of style. Back at the hotel, Nayla opened the window and looked out at Lake Geneva, sparkling under the moon. The wind blew gently, carrying the distant sound of church bells. She thought about her journey, from a girl who was called to the police over a tote bag, to standing before the world talking about kindness. It was all so unbelievable, yet so simple. She whispered, sometimes a small story can resonate forever, like an echo behind a door. The next day, she flew back to America. When she got off the plane, Richard was waiting for her. He held up a handwritten sign that read, welcome back, my girl. Nayla laughed and ran to hug him tightly. Dad, she whispered, everywhere I go, I see Mom. I think she's still watching over us, Richard replied, his voice low and warm. I'm sure she is. She taught me how to listen. I taught the world. She's so proud. That evening, Nayla returned to her apartment and turned on the old radio. Her voice echoed from a replay of the first episode. This is not a story about a flight, but about how people find each other amid misunderstandings. She turned off the radio and sat quietly for a moment. Then she wrote 4 words on a chalkboard. Keep listening. Always. She stepped out onto the balcony, the wind blowing through her hair, the city below glowing brightly. An Aurora airplane flew across the sky, its lights reflecting off her face. She smiled and said softly, thank you, life, for letting me hear. And in the quiet of the night, that voice still echoes, no longer through the radio. No need for a microphone, just the echo of a soul that has learned to be silent to listen to the world and to listen to itself. The Atlanta morning was gentle, the sunlight shining through the thin curtains creating shimmering streaks of light on the walls. Nayla Carter was sitting on the sofa, holding a cup of coffee, her eyes staring far away through the window. Her life was now more peaceful than ever, but in her heart there was always a small void, a void that no amount of applause, no amount of thanks could fill. Perhaps because she knew her story was not really over. There was a knock on the door, 3 slow, firm knocks. She put down her coffee cup and walked to the door. Standing before her was a man in his 40s, tall and thin, wearing a simple white shirt. He held an old envelope, the edges slightly yellowed. There was something strange and familiar about his face. Are you Nayla Carter? His voice was soft and hoarse, like someone who had said many things he had never said before. "Yes, that's me. Are you—" The man took a deep breath, his eyes looking straight at her. "I'm Michael, the younger brother of the man who called the police on Flight 62 that day." The air seemed to freeze. A gentle breeze blew through, carrying the scent of jasmine from the porch. She stood still for a few seconds, then gently opened the door. "Please come in." Michael walked in and placed the envelope on the table. "I know. I probably shouldn't have come. But my brother passed away last month, and before he died, he left me this letter. He said, if possible, to give it to you." Neela sat down, looking at the envelope as if it contained a memory she had tried to bury. "He wrote to me." Michael nodded, his voice trembling. He said he had been carrying regrets for years. Every time he saw a black girl on a plane, he thought of her. He said that was the day he realized he didn't know anything about other people's fears. Nyla opened the envelope, and inside was a handwritten note. The writing was a little scribbled, but clear. She read slowly, each word piercing her heart. "Dear Nyla, I don't know if you'll ever remember me, but I remember you not with pride, but with shame. I was scared that day, not with you, but with the difference I didn't understand. When the police arrived, I saw you sitting there, your eyes unflinching. It was your silence that made me realize I had created the storm without even knowing why. I tried to apologize in many ways, but I didn't have the courage to do it in person. I saw you on TV, saw you talking about forgiveness, and I knew you were over it, but I couldn't get over myself. If you're reading this, I just want to say, thank you for teaching me to listen, even though I was the last one to understand." At the bottom was a small line of text. "I hope, if there is a next life, I will be able to listen before speaking." Nyla folded the letter, tears falling on her hands. Michael sat still, saying nothing. There was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. She looked up, her voice choked but warm. "You know, I used to wonder why that day happened. Now I understand. If it hadn't happened, I probably would never have learned to forgive. Maybe your brother would have too." Michael looked at her, his eyes red. "My brother once said that you changed him. He taught his son that true strength doesn't lie in speaking loudly, but in listening." Nyla smiled slightly. "Maybe, in the end, we're all learning to be more human." Michael stood up, preparing to leave, but before he left, he turned back. "My brother has a daughter named Lily. She really wants to meet you. She said you are the one her father calls the one who saved him without knowing it." Nyla smiled slightly and nodded. "Tell Lily she is always welcome here." When the door closed, Neela sat still for a long time. She took letters from the listeners from the shelf, opened the last page, and added a paragraph. Some letters are not sent, but they still find their recipients. Perhaps that is the universe's way of giving us a second chance to listen to each other. In the evening, Richard came. She told him everything. He was silent, listening as usual, then said softly, "You see, you not only teach others to listen, you also make forgotten pasts speak." Neela looked at him, smiling through her tears. "Dad, maybe this is the ending I never dared to think of." Richard replied, "It's not the end. Son, it's just a new chapter, where silence is no longer a wound, but peace." That night, she sat at her desk, turned on the microphone, and began recording a short message. Her voice was deep and slow, like a whisper in the middle of the night. "Today, a stranger knocked on my door. He brought no accusations, just a letter and an unfinished story. I realized that sometimes forgiveness doesn't need to be spoken. It just needs to be felt by listening sincerely. She paused for a few seconds, then continued, "If you are listening to this, think of the person you have avoided, misunderstood, and wanted to forget. Maybe they are waiting for you to knock on the door. And when that door opens, who knows, you might find yourself." When the recording ended, she played it back and listened to the whole thing, in every word, every breath. She heard not just her own voice, but the echoes of all the people who had passed through her life. The next morning, she posted the recording to her podcast. No introduction, no title, just a short description for the ones who still wait for forgiveness. Within hours, thousands of listens had been recorded, and hundreds of comments poured in tales of reconciliation, tears, and thanks. At the bottom of the comments list, there was a brief line. "Thank you, Neela. I called the friend I lost. He answered." Neela looked at the words and smiled. She knew that her story had finally reached the point it had always been leading up to, where all misunderstandings would be dissolved in the simple sound of an apology, and the words, "I'm listening." The Atlanta sky was a rare blue. Soft morning sunlight filtered through the trees and onto the small courtyard in front of Nyla Carter's apartment. Birdsong and the wind created a peaceful soundtrack she loved. On her desk, her old microphone still sat. Next to it, a notebook filled with scribbles ideas, feelings, and quotes from letters from listeners. Each line felt like a heartbeat, linked to the journey she had taken. A year has passed since Michael brought that letter. Nyla's life is less hectic and bustling than it was at the height of the sound of listening, but it is filled with depth. She teaches, she writes, and most importantly, she continues to listen. This morning, Richard came to visit his daughter. He was still wearing his old gray sweater, carrying a bag of toast and a pot of tea. "Are you still working early in the morning?" he asked, his voice low but warm. "Yes." Nyla smiled, turning to him. "I'm finishing the draft for my new project." "New project?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "Yes. I'm calling it the Listening Foundation, a nonprofit that teaches children and adults listening skills, especially in conflict environments. I want to put the sound of listening into action." Richard was silent for a few seconds, then smiled. "My daughter always knows how to turn sound into hope." She chuckled, opened her laptop, and showed him the plan. In it, she wrote Phase 1, Listen to Heal course, for families who have been separated by misunderstandings. Phase 2, Voices from the Sky program in partnership with Aurora Air, training flight attendants in human communication. At the bottom were the words, "No one is left in silence." Richard read that, his eyes slightly moist. "Nyla, you know, your mother once said that if one day the world could sit down and listen to each other, that would be the first peaceful day of mankind." She held his hand. "I think she is right, and I will try to do that, one by one." A few weeks later, the Listening Foundation officially launched. The event took place in the city's cultural center, which was lined with photos of Nyla's journey, from her Flight 662 cabin to the book launch and Geneva conference. The main hall was packed. Eleanor Reeves stood on stage and said Aurora Air is proud to be associated with Nyla Carter, who reminds us that listening doesn't just save a flight, it saves a soul. When her name was called, Nyla stepped out, wearing a simple white dress, her face radiant but calm. She stood in front of the microphone, smiling. "I never thought I would have this day. I used to just want to be heard, nothing more. But then I understood that if you yearn for something long enough, the universe will make you the one to give it to others." She looked down at the audience. Richard was sitting in the front row, his eyes full of pride. Next to him was Deborah Collins, who is now Aurora Air's lead consultant for human communication training. At the back of the hall, she saw Michael and his daughter Lily, both smiling and waving. Nyla's voice continued over the loudspeakers. "I named this organization the Listening Foundation, because I believe that listening is the foundation of all good things. Without it, there can be no understanding, no healing, and no peace." She paused, took a deep breath. When we truly listen, we are saying to another person, "You exist, you matter." Applause filled the auditorium. The lights dimmed, and a commemorative video was projected. A picture of Nyla from 10 years ago appeared, sitting by the airport window, her eyes worried but full of determination. Then the scene changed. The present image. She stood in the middle of the hall, steady, calm, and radiant. The entire auditorium was silent. Only the soft, emotional music played. When the ceremony ended, everyone came to congratulate her. A boy about 10 years old approached, holding a toy microphone in his hand. "Miss Nyla, my mother told me about you. I want to do a program like you." Nyla knelt down, looked at the boy, and asked softly, "What story do you want to tell?" The boy smiled and immediately replied, "The story of people no one listens to." She laughed and patted his head. "Then you started right." That evening, after everyone had left, Nyla stood alone in the empty lobby. The yellow light bathed her face. She looked up at the large sign hanging in the lobby, which bore the slogan, "Every voice matters." She whispered, "Every voice deserves to be heard." Richard walked over, hands in his pockets. "You know, sometimes I listen to your first episode. Every time I do, it reminds me of your mom. She used to say, if anyone could make the world stop and listen, it would be you." Nyla leaned her head on his shoulder. "Dad, I don't make the world stop. I just help them pause and listen to each other." They laughed together. Their laughter echoed softly in the quiet space, then dissipated into the wind. A few days later, Nyla posted an open letter on the Listening Foundation website. "If you feel like no one understands you, come here. We don't promise to solve every problem, but we promise to listen, because sometimes all it takes is one person listening to make the world a little bit better." In the weeks that followed, her program spread to other cities. Schools began incorporating listening hour into their weekly schedules. Businesses invited her to speak on empathy and communication. Her name appeared in magazines, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of kindness in a fast-paced world. One afternoon, while cleaning her desk, she found the old microphone again. She plugged it in and turned on the recording mode. Her voice came out as soft as a breath. "If you have accompanied me on this journey, thank you. I don't know who you are or where you are, but I know you are listening, and that alone is enough to make this world a warmer place." Outside, dusk was falling. Nyla looked out, saw an Aurora airplane streak across the sky, a long silver trail. She smiled, closing her notebook. "Maybe," she said softly, "every ending is just the beginning of another listening." And so the story ends, not with applause, not with tears, but with the gentle silence of a heart that has learned to listen and be heard. The story Flight Attendant calls Cop on Black Girl, Speechless When Her Dad. The airline CEO arrives is not just an unjust situation, but a journey of awakening compassion. It reminds us that, in a noisy world full of prejudice, listening is the most courageous act. When people dare to stop and look at each other with understanding eyes instead of judgment, all barriers can disappear. Neela, the misunderstood black girl, did not choose revenge, did not choose anger. She chose to listen, chose to turn her pain into a voice of love. It was that calmness that made those who had wronged her look back at themselves. She not only changed the way others saw her, but also changed the way they saw the world. The lesson here is simple yet profound. Forgiveness is not weakness, but the strength of a great soul. When we listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts, we open the way to healing. No matter who you are or what age you are, remember that sometimes what people need most is not advice, but someone who will sit down and really listen. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. If you believe that kindness and understanding can change the world, please join us in spreading this message. Please like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on emotional and humane stories like this. Because who knows, just one time you listen can change someone's life.